The 2023 college football regular season has come to an end, and it certainly lived up to the hype. Many of us thought that it would be an unforgettable season coming into it, and to say that it was would certainly be an understatement. The second to last college football playoff rankings came out last night, and as we approach championship week, the playoff race is heating up more than it ever has before. Based off the games this weekend, some real chaos can definitely ensue, making it an absolute nightmare for the committee on Selection Sunday. In this video, I'm going to be going over all these crazy scenarios, explaining how they can play out, affect all the teams involved, and some of them get crazy, so make sure to stay to the end of the video so you hear those. Now, before we start to discuss any of these actual scenarios, we first need to address the college football playoff as a whole with its rankings and committee. Ever since the playoffs started back in 2014, people have always been complaining about how inconsistent and inaccurate the rankings are. And the biggest thing that I want to harp on here, and I think Nick Saban actually talked about this in an interview with Joel Klatt last season, but the biggest thing I don't like about the college football playoff rankings is they always say how we're ranking the 4 best teams in the country, but they're just clearly not. They're clearly ranking the 4 most deserving teams to be in the college football playoff. And I don't have a problem with that. If you want to rank the 4 most deserving teams because they're a conference champ or because they're undefeated and other teams have multiple losses, then that's fine, but don't tell your fan base that you're ranking the 4 best teams in the country, because you are clearly not. Like, if you're trying to tell me that Florida State without Jordan Travis is better than Oregon, Ohio State, Texas, and Alabama, you are just not right. I'm sorry. I know Florida State's had a great year, and I feel awful for Jordan Travis. I hope for a speedy recovery for him. But you just have to be honest with yourself. Florida State is not one of the 4 best teams in the country right now. That's my biggest issue with the College Football Playoff Committee, is they tell us they're ranking the 4 best teams in the country, but it's clearly the 4 most deserving teams. If you go all the way back a few years ago to 2016, the final rankings were Alabama, Clemson, Ohio State, and Washington. Alabama, Clemson, and Washington were conference champs. Ohio State that year was 11-1. Penn State came in at number 5 with losses that year early in the season. I think they were actually back-to-back losses to Pitt, and they got blown out at Michigan. Now, the committee has never had a 2-loss team in the playoff, and if there was a year for this, it was this year. But after that Michigan loss, Penn State went undefeated, and they obviously beat Ohio State. And at the end of that season, Ohio State beat Michigan. They were both 10-1. So Michigan finished 10-2, Ohio State finished 11-1, and that got Penn State, because Michigan had also lost to Iowa, that got Penn State into the Big Ten championship game. So Penn State was 11-2, Big Ten conference champ, and Ohio State was 11-1, who had lost to Penn State, but Ohio State still gets in. Penn State's sitting on the outside as a conference champ, looking in at a team who is in, who they beat. Now, I'm not saying Penn State was better than Ohio State this year and was the top 4 team in the country. All I'm saying is if we're following this pattern of the 4 most deserving teams, how in the world does Penn State not get in as a conference champ over the team they have a head-to-head matchup with? Now again, I'm just highlighting all of these examples to point out how inconsistent the committee is with these rankings. Now, another important thing to note about the college football playoff is that at the end of each year on Selection Sunday, after all the championship games, you kind of have an idea of who the 4 deserving teams are to be in the playoff. Right, like every year it kind of works itself out. There might be some dispute as to whether they're really the 4 best teams in the country. Like in the past 2 years, you've had, Cincinnati and TCU. There's obviously been some arguments there saying, well, there's way better teams than Cincinnati or TCU, but you clearly understand why they're in, because they're deserving, 13-0 conference champ. There's usually only like 4 teams that are undefeated or only have 1 loss, and the rest just have 2 losses. Now we'll get into this year and how it can get weird. Because even if all the championship games go accordingly, no upsets, all the favorite wins, it won't work itself out like I just talked about. Because there will be 5 Power 5 conference champions. Now, there's 5 Power 5 conference champions every year, but the 5 Power 5 conference champions will either be undefeated or have 1 loss. 5 of them, and there's only 4 spots. That's why this year will be like no other. Now, let's start getting into these actual scenarios. So the first scenario was what I just mentioned. If there are no upsets. If there are no upsets, Georgia would be your SEC champ, Michigan would be your Big Ten champ, and again, in any of these scenarios, I'm not even going to entertain the idea that Iowa would beat Michigan. FSU would be your ACC champ, Texas would be your Big 12 champ, and Oregon is actually favored against Washington, so Oregon would be your Pac-12 champ. Now, I don't think the loser of the Pac-12 championship game will get in. I don't think Oregon and Washington will be in, just for the sake of how many good teams there are. So in all these examples, I'm just going to say Pac-12 champ, because I think the Pac-12 champ is almost a lock. So whether that's Oregon or Washington, it doesn't really matter. Just for the sake of all these scenarios, the Pac-12 winner is in and the loser is out. So in that scenario, you would have Georgia, Michigan, and a 12-1 or an Oregon or a 13-0 Washington as locks. Then it comes down to a 13-0 conference champ Florida State and a 12-1 conference champ Texas. Now, if you're just asking me, if Texas and Florida State were to play at a neutral site, who do you think's the better team? Who would be favored? Who would win? I'm going to say Texas. Texas is going to be favored to win that game, especially Florida State without Jordan Travis. So that's what has to be taken into consideration. Now, the committee would probably put Florida State in there because, like I just talked about, they're a deserving team, 13-0 conference champ. Texas has one loss. As opposed to Texas is probably the better team, and they have the better wins. They have the best win in college football. Double-digit win on the road in Tuscaloosa. That has to be valued. So in that scenario, if you're putting just the 4 best teams in, I think Texas has to go in. And that would probably suck for Texas fans, because you're probably the most nervous team in that scenario, as the committee is definitely going to favor an undefeated ACC champion Florida State over you. Now, let's go over a scenario where Alabama wins the SEC. If Alabama wins the SEC, they have to be in. Just like I said, the Pac-12 champ is in, the SEC champ, in my opinion, is also in. So in scenario 2, if Alabama were to win the SEC and beat Georgia, that puts Alabama in. And the way I see it, if Alabama makes the playoff, you almost have to put Texas in the playoff regardless of what else happens, as long as they beat Oklahoma State, because they have the head-to-head win over Alabama, and that is a great win on the road in Tuscaloosa, which needs to be valued. So that will leave you with Alabama, Texas, Michigan. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because you have your 12-1 Alabama, your 13-0 Michigan, 12-1 Texas. You also have, considering there's no more upsets, a 13-0 Florida State, a Pac-12 champ, and either a 12-1 Oregon or a 13-0 Washington, or a 12-1 non-conference champ in Georgia. Who gets in? I honestly don't know. My vote would go to the Pac-12 team. Pac-12 has probably been by far the best conference this year, so my vote would go to the Pac-12 champ, leaving out Florida State and Georgia. But I just know that the committee is going to do everything they can to get Georgia in, and they would love to have 2 SEC teams in there. Let's move on to a scenario for the Ohio State fans. Ohio State is not out of it yet, but it's going to require a lot more to happen in order for them to make the playoff as compared to last year. All they needed last year was for Utah to beat USC, and they did that handily. That bumped out USC, put Ohio State in for that classic matchup against Georgia. Now this year, they need a little bit more. They need Georgia to be the SEC champ. Because like I said, if Alabama wins and Texas wins their conference championships, they're both going to go in. Alabama would kind of drag Texas in because Texas has that head-to-head win over them. So in this scenario, Ohio State would need Georgia to be the SEC champ. You would have Michigan. You would have your Pac-12 champ. Then Ohio State needs Florida State to lose to Louisville and Texas to lose to Oklahoma State. That bumps out Texas, bumps out FSU. Alabama has 2 losses. They're done. And the loser of the Pac-12 championship game, Ohio State likely goes in over there. I could see Florida State losing to Louisville, but Texas losing to Oklahoma State, the year Texas has had, I just don't see it. But there is a path for Ohio State, and that's it. Now, I'm just going to throw this idea out here. This scenario can't happen. It's already ruled out. But just what if? Imagine if Notre Dame won that game against Ohio State and it was undefeated. So imagine if you had 13-0 Georgia, or even 12-1 SEC champ Alabama and 12-1 Georgia, 13-0 Michigan, like your Pac-12 champ, 13-0 Washington, 12-1 Oregon, 13-0 Florida State conference champ, 12-1 Texas conference champ, and then 12-0 Notre Dame. Just imagine that chaos. Man, that'd be crazy. Obviously that would bump out Ohio State, but that would just be crazy. Like, I can't even imagine what that would be like. It's fun to think about all these scenarios. Now, there is another scenario which would most likely favor 2 SEC teams. So in this scenario, you would also need Florida State and Texas to lose. But if Alabama beat Georgia, and that also happened, you would most likely have Alabama, Michigan, your Pac-12 champ, and then Georgia too. Because based on what the playoff committee has done in recent years, Georgia would get in over Ohio State because they won the SEC, and 2, they played in the conference championship game, whereas Ohio State did not. So if we had to sum all this up and just give an overview of how the playoff will most likely play out, this is what it's going to look like. This is in no particular order or rankings of the teams 1 through 4. It's just a general overview of how things are most likely going to shape out. As long as Michigan beats Iowa, I see 3 spots for 3 conference champions. Those conference champions being Michigan, the winner of the SEC championship game, and the winner of the Pac-12 championship game. There are 3 winners right there from 3 championship games that will definitely be in. The 4th spot is then going to go to Florida State, Texas, Ohio State, or Georgia possibly. If they lost to Alabama, there could still be an argument for them to be in as a 12-1 non-conference champ, but again, back-to-back national champions, there would still be a strong argument for them to get in. And again, that fourth spot, that fourth team is all dependent on what happens in all those scenarios, but just as a general overview, that is how it would look. Again, it would be Michigan, assuming they handle business against Iowa, your SEC champ, your Pac-12 champ. Those 3 spots would be guaranteed. And the 4th spot would either go to Florida State, Texas, Ohio State, or Georgia if they lost to Alabama, depending on what happens in all the different games. And that's it. That's everything I wanted to cover in this video. If I missed anything, if there's another scenario you guys thought about, make sure to drop that in the comments. And as always, I appreciate every single one of you for watching this video. If you're not subscribed, make sure you subscribe. We got great sports content over here. Hype videos, podcasts, weekly recaps. You're not going to want to miss out on any of it. And before we go, I just want to remind all of you that college football will never be the same after this season ever again. So make sure to enjoy this championship weekend, enjoy the playoffs, and just enjoy watching the sport we love the rest of this season. I hope you all have an awesome rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.